Hello, painting friends. This is Ann Brecken. Watercolor is a dynamic paint that can move across the surface of the paper all by itself. This characteristic is part of the delight and magic of working with this medium, but it is also the challenge of it as we work to control the paint for different effects. In this little painting, we have a variety of textures. There are soft streaks in the sky, a controlled soft shape in this distant hill, and very blurry green field grasses. Then there are the shapes on the mountain that are a little bit more focused, and finally, sharp focus, shrubs, grasses, and trees. Creating these different textures is all about judging the wetness of the paper and the paint. So when students ask me how to tame this wild medium, I suggest this study. I'm working on Arches 140-pound cold press paper, and because paint reacts differently on different papers, always do your studies on the same paper that you paint with. I've drawn out a 5x3 grid and labeled it with 5 different wetnesses of paper. So we have dry paper, damp paper, wet paper, very wet paper, and flooded paper. For the rows, 3 different wetnesses of paint. So a dry brush, a wet brush, and a drippy brush. And let's show what we mean by each of those terms. Dry paper, of course, will be exactly what you see, paper with no water at all. I call damp paper, paper that has been wet, but then it has either air dried or you take a thirsty brush and pull off all of the extra water on it so that there is no shine left on the paper at all. Wet paper would have a little bit of a shine on the surface. So as I roll that back and forth, you can see how wet that is. You still see the surface texture of the paper, and there is some shine, but not a lot. Very wet paper would be the next wetness that I would play around with, and on this one, you can see just a little bit of movement in the paper. The flooded paper would be where you would take a brush that is so wet it's dripping and spread it out there, and it's going to be wet enough that if I hold the paper up, you're actually going to see droplets of water form on the edges of the paper. So that would be flooded. When I'm talking about the different wetnesses for the brush, the first term is dry brush. On this one, I had very little water in the brush. I picked up the paint, which is set and dried, and when I run my brush through it, there's no motion on the palette. And when I paint it on the paper, it is staying on the very top surface of the paper and giving me a broken effect. Wet brush would be where the paint is more fluid. When I run my brush through the paint on my palette here, you can see that it's moving a little bit. And when I paint it on the paper, I'm getting a solid coverage. A drippy brush would be where you would add a lot of water to it and then pull up so much fluid in the brush that when you shake it, water will actually drip out of it. And when I paint it on the paper, it's dimensional. I can see a little bit of extra water mounded on the shape. And if I held it, it would also cause a bead at the bottom. So 5 wetnesses of paper to play around with and 3 wetnesses of brush. Let's try those on the grid. But before we do that, let's talk about how different colors react. In watercolor, the term for paint spreading out on a wet surface is called diffusion, and different paints diffuse at different rates. If I take Daniel Smith's sepia and paint it out, I can see that it's moving out a little bit, but really not very much. Purell red is spreading out immediately a little bit more. But watch what happens when I use sap green. So you can see that there's quite a difference between the three pigments. So every pigment you use is going to have a different rate of diffusion. So if you want a lot of control over the shapes you put down, it's a good idea to practice these and play around with the paints that you have on your palette and see what their tendency to spread out is. I'm going to be using Winsor Newton's quinacridone magenta for my study, and I'm going to paint some out. And for this very first study, I'm going to do dry brush on dry paper. So we'll test the dry brush to see that the brush is dry, and then we'll put a little floral shape down. And it's not going to move anywhere because, of course, the paper is dry. This time I'll make the paint more fluid. And we get complete coverage and complete control. If I make the paint really drippy, then it's still on dry paper. So even though the paint is very wet, it's going to stay where I put it. So let's do another column, and this time it's going to be damp paper. So I'll run water over it, but then I'm going to dry my brush out and pull all the extra shine off of the paper. So when you touch it, it should still be cold and wet feeling, but no shine at all. And then we'll try the 3 different brush wetnesses. So here's a drier brush. And you can see that even though the paint doesn't want to come out of the brush, when you put it on damp paper, it pulls the paint right out of the brush and gives you a nice bright shape, and the edges are diffusing out just a little bit. If I make the paint wetter, then it might move a little bit more than that one, but not too much. And then we'll take some real drippy paint. So you can see I ended up with pretty good control, even though the brush was really wet, if the paper is just a little bit damp. We'll go on to wet paper, where this time I want to leave behind a little bit of a shine, but not too much. So I'll wipe my brush off and just go over it and see if I've still got a nice shine. Then we'll test for dry brush, pull some of that extra color and wetness out of it, and paint our flower. And then we'll go with a wetter paint. Now here's where we start to lose some control. If I really fully load the brush up, then this paint is wet enough that on the wet surface, it's going to travel further out. Let's do a row with very wet paper. So this time I'll put down a generous amount of water, and I won't dry it off at all. We'll just leave it extra shiny. dry brush, wet brush, and flooded brush. And our last study is going to be really wet, flooded paper. So I'm leaving behind a lot of water on this one. Test for dry brush and paint it on. Then a wet. And a very full drippy brush. Whether you do a formal study like this or just play around on scrap paper, you will learn a little bit about controlling your shapes in watercolor and see that when the paper is barely damp, even though the brush can be very wet, you'll have more control. And the wetter the paper gets and the more full the brush is, the less control you'll have. And of course, there's nothing to compare with just practicing with lots of paintings. And eventually, you will learn you can be the boss of watercolor. Now let's put this information to use.